I guess we just start talking. I don't know.
I guess we're mic'd up anyway.
Oh, yeah.
So we have no choice in the matter. Well, I'm Jacqueline.
Oh, yeah, you guys can get started. I can do a quick introduction.
Oh, okay, cool.
It's a fireside chat, so
Yeah. It's just a normal conversation with a bunch of people watching. It's,
Right.
pretty normal.
Very natural, very natural. Welcome back from the break, y'all. So we have a fireside chat here with Willie Tran and Jacqueline Siegler. Hello, welcome. Willie, you are Principal Growth Product Manager at Calendly. Awesome, which we use personally. Love it.
Oh,
Love
cool.
the product.
Thank you.
And Senior Product Manager at GoDaddy, another GoDaddy family member. Cool. So y'all are going to be chatting about how to create experiments that do not suck. Which I love. It's probably my favorite title of all of the talks today. So, all right, take it away.
I'll take that as a
Give it up
win.
for Jacqueline and Willie. Woo.
Well, first, I'm just going to say it's such like a pleasure to be back in person, and it feels really good. I was telling Willie this morning that I was feeling a little bit nervous, and I was like, why? Like, we're amongst all product people. So anyway, it's just a pleasure to be here and nice to like see faces and, in real life. So
We're just going to shoot the shit for 30 minutes, and, people are going to take notes for some reason.
So Willie, I know you're working at Calendly now. Can you tell us a little bit about what you do there and a little bit maybe about your background prior to doing so?
Yeah, so right now I lead product growth at Calendly. And so I'm building out the experimentation program there, building out the kind of experimentation culture, all that stuff. And then before this, I also helped start and kind of scale up the product growth teams at Dropbox and MailChimp. So I just really like experimentation.
Okay, very good. So we got the right person for this talk. So just a little bit about myself. So I've been at GoDaddy for the last 2 years, working in product for the last 4. Everyone has their varying paths to product. I worked in finance and corporate strategy and M&A prior to that for 9 years. And at GoDaddy, I think many people know it's for its domains, but it's evolved into having website as well as marketing related products. So I work on both our DIY marketing. So let's just say I own a coffee shop and I want to make a website and then do some social media. I might purchase GoDaddy. And then over time, if I decide like, you know what, marketing, like I don't want to spend time, I don't want to do these social posts. GoDaddy has a services oriented business where you can pay varying a couple $100s a month as a do-it-for-you type of business. And so I also work as a product manager for the services side, which is definitely a more unique and fascinating role where I would say you have almost like 2 customers. You have the customer itself, as well as our services and fulfillment team, who are the ones using the products and different internal tools in order to fulfill that service. So I mentioned that just to learn a little bit more about self and different avenues in product, but it's very relevant in terms of experimentation.
Right on.
So Willie, tell us a little bit more. What does product-led growth mean?
It's funny, I actually Googled it this morning. I ask a lot of people this question too, and it's funny. So when I Googled it, I was reading a bunch of articles, and I found a lot of articles that talked a lot but didn't say anything. And maybe you all feel similar. It's like you read these blogs and you're like, oh wow, this is really insightful. Then you like walk away and you're like, wait, this is not applicable at all, right? And because a lot of people say like, yeah, it's like this thing where your product is the thing that leads, and that's the reason why people purchase. It's like, okay. But so to me though, and I've asked a lot of people this and I get a lot of different answers, so it's totally fine. And the reason I Googled it, because I wanted to see, like, we're in a conference right now at Product-Led Alliance, right? And I'm willing to bet that a lot of people here don't have a unanimous understanding of what it is. And that's totally fine, that's totally fair, right? But so for me, what I think product-led growth is essentially down to the executional level. It is more or less running experiments, or really a way to measure noticeable impact or improvement to your product, usually through like the common metrics, like the pirate metrics, right? So it's like acquisition, activation, revenue, retention, referral, right? So it's like, how do you actually measure that? Because you can do like kind of quasi-experiments where you launch it and then you observe a metric over time, controlling for like certain time windows. Okay, that's fine. But it's not always good to do that because you then run into effects of seasonality. And if you don't have enough scale, you may need to kind of test these time windows for longer, which then you're doubly screwed. So like, it's to me, it's again just about it's about an experimentation program. That's really what it is for me, because I don't see another way that you can improve a product or do PLG without understanding how much you moved something by. And maybe that's controversial. But otherwise, to me, everything else is just regular core product management.
Okay.
Except enterprise, I guess, but whatever.
Yeah, from what my experience of is, GoDaddy does have growth PMs is that is focused on enabling a smoother purchase path. What's the way to attract more users to bring them through the funnel? Potentially like change how we describe different plan variants, all of that. That's my take on what is product-led growth.
It sounds like they're doing it more or less right. They're so long as they're designing these experiments in a way that don't suck. No, but like, so long as they're designing these experiments in a way that they're actually learning something, they're not just like throwing random stuff at the wall. Like that is really a difference between like an okay-ish experimentation program and like a good one, but not a great one, but just a good one. And yeah, it sounds like they're doing it pretty well. I mean, it can, like, are they? Can I ask, like, how many experiments? Like, how long has the experimentation program been around at GoDaddy?
All right, well, we're getting right into it. Maybe we'll take a step back first.
Okay, my bad.
Let's level set first, because first we level set on what is product-led growth. But why don't we level set first on what is experimentation?
Okay, fair. Yeah. Well, for me, it's just a vehicle to learn. And I think what it isn't, it's not just testing your idea, which I think that's what a lot of people think it is. They're like, this is like how experimentation ideation usually starts. It's like, wouldn't it be cool if we did a insert idea? I'm like, yeah, but like, oh, what about this? Oh, I don't know. Let's A/B test it, right? And like that is not the way it should go, right? When you're setting up an experimentation program or an experiment, your objective is to learn. To learn about the users. You're not trying to learn, is my idea good, right? That's a terrible experiment. It's more so around, what is the problem? How can we better understand the problem that the user is experiencing that's not allowing them to, say, activate, right? Is our onboarding too long, right? So if I ask those questions, ideally, your brain should be jumping to different potential hypotheses or executional elements that should be testing that, right? So, okay, well, what if we do an exclusion test that cuts our 4-page onboarding flow down to 3 or 1, right? If you have low traffic, you do it to 1 to increase the minimum detectable effect, whatever. So, like, to me, but the answer, though, the thing is that when you run that experiment, your objective should be to answer a question, not to test your idea. And that's a really big distinction, like that people frequently get wrong. Instead, we've often seen experimentation be used as a political tool as opposed to actually more of like a behavioral science.
When you say political tool, what do you mean by that? Or elaborate.
Are you familiar with like the concept of HIPPO, like the highest paid person's opinion? So, like that's a very common thing. Like, is the VP of whatever will come in and he or she will say like, hey, why don't we do this? And it's kind of like the scenario I just said actually. Like, why don't we do this? And it's like, and the PM will be like, I don't know. Like, why don't you just A/B test it and we'll see if it's any good? And that's what happens, right?
Sure.
It's this political tool. It almost becomes a decision-making tool as opposed to an insights generation tool.
I like that.
So and insights compound, right? Whereas decisions, they tend to be, well, they compound too, but most of the time they tend to be thought of on a kind of more flat plane.
Got it. Can't say I think I would respond too favorably if someone in that HIPAA group just came in and said, well, why don't we experiment that? Like, no, like, please. Anyway, so experimentation at GoDaddy, fortunately, the leadership tends to be, have product backgrounds, and so there's been a real strong emphasis on experimentation over the last 2 years or so. And I will say, I think it would create excitement amongst the product team, but also created like a lot of anxiety. In that, there was already a lot of pressure to meet your roadmap milestones. You're already also doing the keep the lights on. It felt like experimentation was like another thing. And so it's like, well, we're already being asked to do so much. Like, how do you balance that? And so I think what's been really helpful and like sort of alleviating that pressure, and what you reference, Willie, is that it's really experimentation is about learning. And then I think more so it's about learning with the emphasis on customer value. So like because we have our internal teams, we will do testing in terms of if we're going to make an improvement to internal tooling, and we want to see if our fulfillment teams will be able to get through their jobs, let's say, more efficiently and others. But if we're talking about the customer side, it should be really driven by like, are we going to do this experiment because it gets a customer some better experience? Or like you said, is it because we want to like test out this idea? Or like we want to test like, does this work? And it's like, well, that's where the variance starts coming in.
Yeah, it's kind of like a release mechanism, right? And to be fair, it is a pretty daunting thing. I've had a lot of PMs, like, it was always interesting because it's like a big part of my job like that I've experienced over Dropbox, MailChimp, and now Calendly is getting leadership excited about experimentation. This was actually a big problem at Dropbox, but and eventually it became well known. But like, but then like PMs will start to come up to me and be like, hey, I want to run an experiment. That's so cool. Like as a person who does a lot of experiments, it's so cool. And another PM is like, hey, I want to start running an experiment. And then I'm like, all right, cool. Like let's approach this. And most of the time they come to me with an idea already. Mm-hmm. Like, I want to run this as an experiment. And I'm like, hold on. This is a cool idea, I'm sure. But like, what are you trying to do? Like, what are you trying to figure out? What's this problem you're trying to solve? What's the questions you're trying to answer here? And they're like, I don't know. And I'm like, okay, that's fine. Like, let's take a step back, right? Like, and sometimes they don't have the metric figured out either. And I'm like, oh, okay, that's not good, but okay, let's keep going. And then okay, and then we'll work through it. We'll get some of that stuff, and then. And by the way, at this point, right, we're so far past that original idea that the core PM wanted to run. They're deflated. You see it, They're like, fuck, this is so far from what I wanted. Like this, now you're making me do math. Mm-hmm. And and I do, okay, to be clear, I do. And I pull out the sample size calculators, and then we find out that like, oh yeah, this experiment's gonna run for 6 months. And they're like, oh. Wow, Will, you just completely shot down my idea. And then they're like, I'm never going to run an experiment again. I'm never even going to think about it. And so they're just going to, so it's like, man, how do you make that more approachable? How do you, I've since learned to move the goalpost forward. But that's another thing. But like, but it's interesting because it's this weird thing where we can talk about how valuable experimentation is, but the truth is it actually is very difficult to get started. Mm-hmm. It's very easy to make an experiment that sucks. Mm-hmm. And even furthermore, it's incredibly easy to make an invalid experiment.
And what is an invalid experiment?
The example I like to use is like, let's say this. I'm going to flip a coin 6 times. And if you do them, there's a probability that it will land heads, let's just say 5 out of 6 times. Okay, I really should have chosen 4 because I can't do what 5 divided by 6 is on the screen on the stage here. But so like, let's just say that's like, I don't know, like 15% or something, right? And 70 or 85%. Then that's like, okay, cool. I flipped a coin 6 times, landed heads 5 out of 6 times. Therefore, every time you flip a coin, 85% of the times it'll land heads. I say this out loud, you guys are like, that's a dumb, like you're an idiot, Willie. But we do that all the time with experiments. We do this all the time because we'll say, I'm sure I'd love to know how many people like here have been in an experience where you ask, hey, how long should this experiment run for? And someone just says like, I usually just let it run for 2 weeks. Like, yeah, like, and that's really bad, right? Because you didn't actually calculate how many samples you need to collect in order for this experiment to be valid. And this is assuming frequentist. Maybe you do Bayesian, right, or whatever, but we'll talk, that's a whole other thing. But like, but that's essentially the same thing as me flipping a coin 6 times and winning heads 5 times or 4 times, whatever, and concluding that this is conclusive. But that experiment is actually invalid. Those results are not valid. But instead what happens is they then measure the results of that, and let's say they do the stat sig calculations, and they'll go and then present those numbers as gospel and truth. Mm-hmm. That's like really bad, because then you're essentially disinformation, right? And then you're saying like, hey, we just increased the bottom line by $10 million, but no, you didn't. It's probability, like it's a random error.
So since you're using a lot of good, bad terms, what's the way that you have the methodological like systems in place? What do you use at Calendly or past organizations in terms of actually to implement experimentation and making sure that you're reaching that statistical significance?
This question can kind of be broken down a couple ways. So like, in regards to ensuring that the experiment is valid, right? It's kind of simple stuff. It's just like, what's the baseline conversion rate? And you decide kind of what you want the statistical power to be, right? So like, how confident are you that, this is not stat sig confidence. This is like, how confident are you that this experiment is valid, okay? This has nothing to do with whether the results are stat sig. And then you choose the minimum detectable effect, which is essentially a sensitivity. Like how much are you changing the user experience? How much are you expecting the number to move by, probably in a relative degree, by this? So you put that in, and it gives you a number, right? If you use like the Evan Miller calculator, that's what I still use, right? It's awesome. And it'll tell you essentially like, okay, this experiment needs, I don't know, 20,000 exposures per variant, right? So let's say you're doing a control and 1 treatment, so that's 40,000. And then you run it for 40,000, right, to maybe if you want to do 100% traffic exposure, that's cool. And then you conclude it after 40,000. And mind you, like places like Airbnb, Facebook, and other kind of more advanced places, they don't do it like this, but that's a whole other conversation. But for smaller companies and newer companies, this is how they'll more likely run. And after that, you look at the results, and then you see if the more or less the median or mean, whichever one you care about, is statistically significantly different in your treatment versus your control. Mm-hmm. And you just put that into another calculator too. And that'll tell you. And whether it's like 90, 95, 99, I think we're all pretty familiar with that. But I have thoughts on that too, but whatever. And then after that, you conclude it. So that's like how I test whether it's invalid. In regards to a framework to ensure that we're not just throwing stuff at the wall, but there's like a real experimentation strategy involved, that's a pretty different. So like the framework that I adopt in all my teams is and teach is essentially like you always have to start off when you're starting a new team with questions. Like never come in with tactics, in my opinion. That's the first thing we feel inclined to do is come in with tactics, ideas, a bunch of experiment ideas. We always want to do that, but I like really implore you to not. Instead, come in with questions. Work with your team collaboratively to create a question backlog, right? You literally just come in with a bunch of like, okay, like do users, like what are the features that users need to feel before they use before they activate, right? So that's kind of a quantitative measure, but like, or like, at what point does a user feel confident to share an invite with another user, right? That's a qualitative one. And you generate this backlog and you answer a bunch of these questions. And this gives you a good insight into what is stopping the user from doing what you want them to do. In this case, we'll just say activation, okay? Since everyone wants to move activation, right? And then what happens is you come up with the problem statements. So it's like, as a user, I want to, I don't know, complete the checkout flow, but there's too much information here, right? So, and then for each problem statement, you then do an ideation session with your team around potential experiments. So it has a one-to-many relationship. So one problem statement has many experiments, and then you run the experiment. right? And mind you, the point is that this all has a logical flow back to it, all right? So every experiment you run relates to a problem statement, a validated one, which relates back to a question that you originally got insight from, which is preventing activation, right? So it's all perfectly logical, not perfectly, whatever. But like, and then you run the experiment, get an insight, which usually leads to more questions, which leads to more insights, which leads to more problem statements, which leads to more experiments, so on, so on, so on. So that's like the machine that I've kind of built at Calendly, and I did a similar one at MailChimp as well.
Got it. Nice. At GoDaddy, like I mentioned, that they really, the leadership really instituted experimentation, and I think one of the challenges is that GoDaddy is a pretty large company and has about, I want to say, about 200 PMs, of which, many with different backgrounds, experiences, also some having had no experience in experimentation, myself included. And so it was a bit intimidating, like you were alluding to. And I think one of the things that's been really, really helpful is they and then different teams have established a consistent framework in terms of setting out objective, observation, hypothesis, what are the key KPIs they are going to measure. And it sounds kind of like rudimentary, but I would say having that emphasis on having the clarity and then also consistency across the how you're approaching experimentation, especially if you're going to have other members of the organization outside of products start doing experimentation. That's been really, really helpful, and I found it useful. And then if you're also thinking about, let's say if you're more in the leadership team or even amongst your PM team, reviewing experiments that each of the team, individually, then you're also reviewing them in a consistent way, as opposed to like this person ran an experimentation and like they had some other completely varying way to like present the results. Having a consistency, like then it just enables almost like through osmosis, but just like consistency in reviewing what was the hypothesis, what was the result, has really, I think, benefited the organization and myself and the product.
What's funny is when you were talking about objective, hypothesis, observation, blah, blah, you know what that is?
You're like, nah, that's bad.
No. That's the scientific method. It's like the thing that we learned in 5th grade that we just conveniently forgot. And like, that's all it is. That's all we do. That's all we do. But instead, we start with solution or whatever the.
Yeah.
Right. Whatever that.
What's the
I actually don't
design?
know the scientific method either. But like, no. But isn't that crazy though? Like, it's actually super fundamental stuff that we learn in like 5th grade or whatever. And for some reason, when it comes to running experiments, I often find that we just kind of forget that, right? And then you realize how much of this is so emotional, which is dangerous. I'm kind of a sociopath when it comes to my experiments. I like don't care how they do.
Meaning, in terms of not being attached to the results.
I'm not attached. I'm never excited when I launch something. Yeah, it's really bad. You guys probably think I'm crazy, but like I've been hurt so many times.
But I think there's a lot of validity to that too, because part of the discouragement or like what's the intimidation around the experiments is that there's a pressure, desire to feel like you have to create a winning experiment, and something that the people on our experimentation team and leadership continue to enforce. Having an experiment that's a loss doesn't mean that was like a bad or like a waste of time. You still learn something.
100%.
And I think for myself that's definitely been like, it's alleviated some of the pressure, but I think it's also just, again, putting that emphasis on learning. Oh, how are we doing on time? Oh, we've been chatting. Okay, so let's just make sure we get to the specific topic.
Oh yeah,
what is an experiment that sucks?
It's just one that you don't learn anything from, right? Like my least favorite experiment generated somewhere between like $5 to $8 million for Dropbox, an incremental annual recurring revenue. That was a shitty experiment, even though I had a great win. Okay, I'm not upset. But like the reason it sucked is because we changed so many variables that after we concluded, I have no idea what actually caused it. Like, I have no idea what actually caused this huge shift in money, and then I had to do a bunch of experiments afterwards to like kind of figure out what actually caused it. But that was a really terrible experiment. My favorite one, I ran recently, which led to a decrease in activation, because it told us that that's why at Calendly we don't do the best job of letting people know that they're about to enter a trial. So I'm working on it. But like, and so we wanted to figure out like, by notifying them once they sign up, how much will this affect our users' behavior, right? In regards to activation, feature adoption, things like that. And we saw that things went down. I was like, so not only do we see that it was negative, right? But we also now see by how much. And that's really important because that will tell you, okay, well, how much do we value this drop in metric versus a better user experience, right? And it allows us to kind of, again, have a much more informed approach, a de-risked almost approach. Whereas before, it's somewhere between, I don't know, 0 and 100. Now I definitively know it's this number. And that's like incredibly powerful. Even though it was a losing experiment, it was one of the best experiments I ever ran. And I'm so pleased with it. Obviously, we didn't productionize it.
I think just the key learning that I've had is that in terms of what's an experimentation that sucks is really if you can't measure the result. Because that ultimately, it means it's that like you didn't get the benefit of all that time you invested in. If you've set like, it may be because of different variants, but ultimately if you actually, for data reasons or because it's more qualitatively driven or actually it's like human driven, but like you didn't actually get to like what was the outcome, that's like, to me, that's the suck.
Super common.
Yeah.
And sometimes you just learn, like inconclusive results are great too, because then you learn that lever is not really a lever, right? If you should just be happy that you hit stat sig on anything, because that means that you pulled a lever and it affected the user. You just pulled it in the wrong direction if it's negative, right? So then you just have to turn it the other way. So because apathy is the greatest enemy of our users. So if you can find where people care, you just have to figure out how to manipulate it.
All right, now we've definitely been going on for too long, so let's take a question, please. Thank you.
So I want to follow up on this so-called failed experiment.
Yeah.
Actually not a failed experiment.
It was a great experiment. Yeah.
Then what did you do next?
Oh, it was very recent, just to be clear, so I may not give you like the best answer.
I want to know the answer.
So
What experiment would you build to gain value, additional
Right.
value from that?
Right. So this is a great question, right? So like, if you're ever struggling to decide what to do next, look back to your hypothesis. So a good hypothesis is constructed of 3 components, right? So it's, generally speaking, it's by execution, we'll see increase or decrease in metric because assumption, right? So this means 3 things, right? You can just go back and say, our execution was wrong, our metric was wrong, which is surprisingly common, and then our assumptions were wrong. One of those or all of those are wrong. So essentially, what we're looking at now is like our assumption is true, right? We know that people don't know that they're in a trial, right? And they're not going to be happy. That was our main assumption. Our metric is right as well, because it moved activation negatively. And then our execution was wrong. So the question is now, so now I'm working with the design to essentially go back and look at this and say, okay, what are the different ways we can drive awareness that they're in a trial without being just so upfront about it? So to answer your question, it's, again, I don't want to give you all tactics. I want to give you all frameworks and ways of thinking, right? So it's go back to your hypothesis and look at one of those 3 things and see where you think the things could be wrong. But I guarantee you the next step is in one of those 3 things.
So assumption, metric, execution.
So by execution, we'll see increase or decrease in metric because assumption. And always write your hypotheses like this, always. It helps you so much. Future you will thank you.
Do we have time?
Yeah, we have time for one more.
Thank you. I know that a lot of what we talked about has been about like quantitative data, so it's like looking at stat sig results.
Yeah.
But I was wondering, how do you value like qualitative feedback from users, and like how do you bring that into your framework and doing experiments?
Yeah, so that's what goes into the problem statements. So you take that data and you like really look at it and you try to come in and look at that data kind of holistically and kind of go, okay, here's some common trends I'm seeing. This is why people are not. This also assumes that you're asking the right questions, right? So like, which is a whole nother talk. But like, so once you take that data, it then generates the problem statements. And that gives you the clarity that your team needs to come up with the right solutions for said problem. I always believe solutions are easy, questions are hard, right? And I think the qualitative part that you're mentioning is the most critical part of experimentation. That's the oft overlooked. But it really, it feeds good experimentation. That's really where it plays.
If I may give another anecdote, I recently worked on a new branding product that is effectively a version 2 of what has been existing for this set group of customers. And how we approached it was that we created a new Figma design, like new structure for it, gave a prototype, and we did interviews with these customers. And so we had a series of qualitative questions, but then I said, okay, like if I'm gonna come out of this experiment, what's a way that I can take some quantitative aspects as well? And so those same customers with their previous brand experience had a CSAT score.
Oh, yeah.
So in the interview, I asked a series of qualitative driven questions, and then I asked them a question that effectively got to the CSAT score, like how would you rate this, or what's your expectation of this on a scale of 1 to 10? And so then I was able to reference their past CSAT scores to give a quantitative measure, but then also have the qualitative through the question and answers that really gave a illuminating response, and more than just like, if I had only sent them a survey of this new prototype with a CSAT and that was it, I wouldn't have gotten the real feedback that I needed to have. So it was a good balance that way.
All right, thank you so much to our fireside chatters.
Good job.